There is a moment from a 1979 television appearance that Frank Sinatra's team tried to have edited out of the broadcast. They didn't succeed. The moment lasted 11 seconds. It involved Keith Richards saying a single sentence in response to something Sinatra had said. Nobody who was in that room forgot it. And when you hear what Keith actually said, you'll understand why Sinatra never mentioned Keith Richards in public again. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what Frank Sinatra represented in 1979. He was 63 years old. He had been the most famous singer in America for the better part of 4 decades. He had survived the bebop era, the rock and roll explosion, the British invasion, disco, survived all of it not by adapting but by refusing to. Sinatra had never pretended to like what came after him. He had never softened his position for the sake of diplomacy or industry politics. He had said in various forms and at various volumes that rock and roll was the music of people who could not sing, played by people who could not play, for audiences who did not know the difference. He had been saying versions of this since 1957. By 1979, it had become something close to a philosophy. Keith Richards was 35 years old in November of 1979. The Rolling Stones had been one of the most successful rock bands in the world for 16 years. He had spent those 16 years being told in various ways and by various people that what he did was not real music. He had never particularly cared. He had grown up listening to American blues and rhythm and blues, the music that Sinatra's generation had largely ignored, the music that had been made by Black American artists in circumstances that the mainstream industry had spent decades refusing to acknowledge. Keith Richards knew exactly where rock and roll had come from. He knew its lineage better than most of the people who dismissed it. The Music Industry Gala of 1979 was a televised awards event held at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles. It was the kind of event that the industry held partly to celebrate itself and partly to be seen celebrating itself, with cameras positioned to capture the tables as much as the stage. The guest list represented the full spectrum of American popular music across 4 decades, jazz musicians who had started in the 1940s, seated alongside producers who had shaped the sound of the 1970s, veterans of the swing era in the same room as people who had grown up listening to the music those veterans had spent 20 years dismissing. It was, in other words, a room full of people who had strong and irreconcilable opinions about what music was supposed to sound like and who deserved credit for it. The production team had thought about this. They had arranged the seating with some care. The seating had been organized by a production coordinator named Sandra Ellison, who had spent 3 weeks managing 400 guests across 60 tables and had not, in the accumulated pressure of that process, fully considered the implications of placing Keith Richards and Frank Sinatra in adjacent sightlines with cameras rolling and a long evening ahead of them. Keith arrived at table 7 at 8:15 in the evening with his manager and 2 members of his inner circle. He was dressed the way Keith Richards was always dressed, in a way that suggested the concept of formal attire had been presented to him and he had taken it as a loose suggestion. He found his seat, ordered a drink, and settled in with the particular ease of a man who has attended enough industry events to have stopped being impressed by them. Frank Sinatra arrived at table 3 at 8:30. The room registered his arrival the way rooms always registered Sinatra's arrival, with a slight collective shift in attention, a reorientation of energy toward the point where he had entered. He moved through the space with the specific authority of a man who had never, in his adult life, walked into a room that did not know who he was. The evening proceeded through its scheduled program. Awards were presented. Performances were given. The cameras moved between the stage and the tables in the practiced way of a production that had done this before. For the first hour and a half, tables 3 and 7 existed in parallel without intersection. At 9:41, during a break between segments, a production assistant made the decision to seat several guests at a combined table near the front of the room for a filmed conversation segment. The intention was to capture the informal atmosphere of the evening. Frank Sinatra was one of the guests selected. Keith Richards was another. The conversation was moderated by the evening's host, a television personality named Gerald Cross. The segment was intended to run for 6 minutes. It ran for 4 minutes and 53 seconds before the producer in the truck called for a cut to commercial. For the first 3 minutes, the conversation was what these conversations always were. Industry pleasantries, careful compliments, the polished surface of people who are aware of the cameras and conducting themselves accordingly. Sinatra spoke about the state of American music with the measured authority of a man delivering a position he had refined over decades. He was charming. He was precise. He was, as he almost always was in public, completely in control of the room. Then the host, attempting to generate the kind of spontaneous tension that makes television interesting, turned to Keith Richards and asked what he thought about the direction popular music had taken in the past 20 years. It was a reasonable question. It was also, given who was sitting across the table, a question with a charge in it. Keith considered it for a moment. The table watched him. There is a specific quality to the pause Keith Richards takes before he says something important. Not a theatrical pause, not the pause of someone constructing an effect, but the pause of someone who is deciding how much of what they actually think they are going to say out loud. This was that pause. Then he began to speak, not defensively, not with the posture of someone who is preparing to argue, but with the calm of someone who simply has a view and is going to express it. He talked about the blues. He talked about the specific geography of it, the Mississippi Delta, the specific towns and juke joints and recording studios where the foundation had been built. He talked about Robert Johnson recording in a San Antonio hotel room in 1936. He talked about muddy waters and the specific tradition that rock and roll had grown directly from, note by note, chord by chord. He spoke with a knowledge and a precision that visibly surprised several people at the table, because the version of Keith Richards that existed in the public imagination in 1979 was not primarily associated with musicological depth. He was supposed to be the chaos, the danger, the man who had been arrested in 5 countries and survived circumstances that had killed lesser constitutions. He was not supposed to know the recording dates of Robert Johnson's sessions. Frank Sinatra listened to this with an expression that was not quite patience. When Keith finished, Sinatra set down his glass and looked at him directly and said, in the tone of a man who was not asking a question but delivering a verdict, "You and your generation took American music and made it ugly. You took something that required craft and discipline and you replaced it with noise. And you called that liberation." The table went quiet. The host opened his mouth and closed it again. Keith Richards looked at Frank Sinatra for a moment. Not a long moment. The cameras caught it. 2 seconds, maybe 3, of Keith simply looking at him with an expression that was not anger and was not deference and was not anything that the people at that table could immediately categorize. Then Keith said, quietly and without emphasis, as though he were making an observation about the weather, "The music you're describing was made by black men in Mississippi who you never once put on your stage." 11 seconds of silence. The producer in the truck called for commercial. Frank Sinatra did not respond. Not in those 11 seconds. Not after the commercial break, when the segment resumed with a conspicuous change of subject. Not in the car afterward, according to his personal assistant who was present. Not in any interview, any conversation, any public or private forum that anyone has been able to document in the decades since that evening. What Keith Richards had said was not an attack. It was not a provocation constructed for effect. It was a fact, a specific, verifiable, historically grounded fact about the origin of the music being discussed. Sinatra's generation had built its version of American sophistication on a foundation that had been laid by artists who were not invited to the same hotels, the same television programs, the same industry galas. The swing era, the Great American Songbook, the entire edifice of mid-century American popular music had existed alongside a parallel tradition that it had largely ignored and occasionally appropriated. Keith Richards had grown up studying that parallel tradition. He had built his career on it. And he had said so in 11 seconds in a way that left no room for a comfortable response. Sinatra's team contacted the production the following morning. They requested that the exchange be removed from the broadcast. The production consulted with its legal team and declined. The segment aired as recorded, including the 11 seconds, including the silence, including the moment when the camera caught Sinatra's face in the 3 seconds after Keith spoke. 17 calls came in the morning after the broadcast. 15 from journalists, 2 from Sinatra's office. The journalists wanted a comment from Keith. Keith did not provide one. The calls from Sinatra's office did not specify what they wanted, which is sometimes the loudest way of specifying exactly what you want. Keith Richards was asked about the incident exactly once in a 1981 interview with a British music magazine. The interviewer described the televised moment and asked if Keith had intended to cause offense. Keith thought about it for a moment and said, "I wasn't trying to cause anything. I was just saying where the music came from. It came from somewhere specific." It came from specific people. That seems worth mentioning. He was not asked about it again for many years. When he was, he said approximately the same thing. The people at the table who heard it clearly described the same experience in subsequent conversations. A journalist named Patricia Howe, who was seated 2 tables away and had turned to watch when she sensed the energy shift, said later that the sentence was delivered so quietly and so without drama that for a split second she wasn't certain she had heard it correctly. She had. The camera operator closest to the table, a man named Ray Castillo, who had worked in television for 22 years, said that in 2 decades of filming live events, he had never seen a room go that quiet, that fast, without something catastrophic happening. Nothing catastrophic had happened. A man had stated a fact. That was all. That was enough. There is a reason that sentence landed the way it did. It was not because it was clever. It was not because it was cruel. It landed because it was true, and because it was the one response that Sinatra's position had no architecture to absorb. The argument that rock and roll had cheapened American music was an argument about aesthetics and taste and standards, the kind of argument that can be debated endlessly because it rests on nothing more solid than opinion. But the argument that the music being dismissed had been made by specific people in specific circumstances who had been systematically excluded from the industry that later profited from their work, that was not an aesthetic argument. That was a historical one, and history does not negotiate. There is something worth saying about the 2 men sitting at that table. They were not, in the ways that mattered most, opposites. They were both men who had come to their music through deep and serious study. They were both men who knew the history of what they were doing and could speak about it with authority. They were both men who had fought, in different ways and against different resistance, to be taken seriously on their own terms. Sinatra had fought against an industry that had not always welcomed Italian Americans. Keith had fought against an industry that had not always welcomed the music he was making. Both of them knew something about being told that what you were doing did not deserve the name of art. Frank Sinatra was born in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1915 to Italian immigrant parents. He had built his career from nothing against the resistance of an industry that did not always welcome him, through talent and determination and a stubbornness that his friends and enemies both described in identical terms. He was not a man without understanding of what it meant to be excluded, which may be part of why he did not respond. Some silences are the sound of recognition. Keith Richards knew where the music came from. He had known since he was a teenager in Dartford, sitting in his bedroom with American import records that were nearly impossible to find in England, learning the guitar by slowing down Muddy Waters records until he could hear each note individually. He had spent his entire career trying to honor that origin, trying to make music that acknowledged its debt rather than concealing it. When Sinatra called that music noise, he was not just dismissing Keith Richards. He was dismissing Robert Johnson. He was dismissing Muddy Waters. He was dismissing a tradition that had crossed the worst possible circumstances and rebuilt itself into something that changed the course of human expression. Keith said so. One sentence, without raising his voice, without anger or performance or any desire to win the room. He had not come to that table looking for a confrontation. He had been seated there by a production team and asked a question, and he had answered it honestly, the way he answered most things, without ornament and without particular concern for how the answer would land. The fact that it landed the way it did was not his design. It was simply the consequence of saying something true in a room that had been successfully avoiding it for a long time. The record of that evening exists in the television archive. The segment has been seen by relatively few people. It was a 1979 industry event, not a moment that was preserved by the culture the way certain other televised confrontations have been. But the people who have seen it describe the same thing. The sentence, the silence, the expression on Frank Sinatra's face in the 3 seconds before the cut to commercial. Not anger, not contempt, something quieter and harder to name. The expression of a man who has heard something he cannot immediately answer and is deciding whether that matters. The music came from somewhere. It came from specific people. That seemed worth mentioning. 11 seconds of silence at a table in Los Angeles in 1979. Then a commercial break. Then a career that continued for both men for another 20 years, in parallel, without further public intersection. The record stands as it was broadcast. The sentence is there. The silence is there. And anyone who wants to understand where rock and roll actually came from, not the mythology, not the marketing, not the carefully constructed origin stories that the industry prefers, has to start with the same place Keith Richards started, Mississippi. The blues, specific people, specific circumstances, a tradition that was there before any of them and will be there long after all of them are gone. If this story made you think, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Did you know the full history of where rock and roll actually came from? Share this with someone who loves music history. And ring the notification bell for more untold stories about the people behind the sound of the 20th century.